They called it Troy's rival, but Troy was a legend. Candia was real. For 21 years, this fortress became a machine that ground through well over 100,000 lives, reducing an empire's pride to smoke and rubble. Welcome to Candia, a fortress so geometrically perfect that European engineers swore it was unbreakable. A city where the heirs of the Ottomans, the same empire that had shattered the legendary walls of Constantinople, found themselves staring at a riddle made of stone and earth that they couldn't solve. This is the story of a war fought by extremes. It began with the rage of a mad sultan, Ibrahim I, a man imprisoned in a cage for his youth, now willing to drown the Mediterranean in blood over a single insult to his harem. Pitted against him was the conniving pragmatism of the Venetian Republic, a merchant empire so desperate to fund the war that they sold their own nobility to the highest bidder just to buy more gunpowder. It was a clash of paradoxes. Devout Christian knights acting as pirates on the high seas against warmongering Ottoman viziers who believed their brutal path was ordained by God. But the true war wasn't just on the walls, it was in the dark. It was a deadly chess match between two architects. On one side, Georg Rimpler, the loyal German genius who built killing zones inside the breaches. On the other, Andrea Barozzi, the bitter Venetian traitor who walked into the enemy camp and sold the blueprints of the city for a bag of gold. The Venetians authorized biological warfare, attempting to infect the Ottoman camps with a quintessence of plague distilled from the buboes of the dead. It was a siege of psychological torture where the Venetians paraded a kidnapped boy on the ramparts, a false prince raised as a Christian friar, taunting the Ottoman soldiers with the sight of a sultan's son wearing a monk's habit. Men arrived here as boys and died as grandfathers in the exact same trenches. An entire generation was born, fought, and buried without ever leaving the shadow of these walls. Two empires emptied their treasuries, bankrupted their futures, and bled a generation white, all for one city. This is the Siege of Candia, the war that neither side could win and neither side could stop. The longest siege in history began with a pirate raid. The year is 1644. A massive, heavily laden Ottoman convoy is sailing from Alexandria to Constantinople. It is a floating palace. On board is the former chief black eunuch of the Sultan's harem, Sambuli Hyacinth Aga, who is traveling with 40 splendid horses on the ship. But the most valuable passengers are a young woman and an infant boy. She is the wet nurse to the Sultan's son, and the child is her own. Off the coast of Rhodes, 6 galleys appear on the horizon. They fly the white cross of the Knights of Malta, a militant order of Christian corsairs. The knights attack. The battle is chaotic. On the Ottoman ship, the horses break loose on the gun deck, trampling sailors and preventing the crew from using their cannons. The Ottoman captain screams at the chief eunuch, "Cursed Arab, did I not tell thee to put arms and ammunition into the ship instead of horses?" The captain kills the eunuch on the spot before being cut down himself. The knights board the ship, seize the treasure, and capture the wet nurse and the child. When the news reached Constantinople, it didn't just cause anger, it caused madness. The Sultan was Ibrahim I. History calls him Ibrahim the Mad. He had spent his youth imprisoned in the palace cage, leaving him volatile and dangerous. When he heard that his son's wet nurse, a woman he treated as a favorite, was a prisoner, he demanded the extermination of the Knights of Malta. But attacking the fortress island of Malta was too risky. His advisors pointed him toward a softer target, the island where the knights had stopped to sell their loot, the Venetian island of Crete. Venice pleaded innocence, but the Sultan wanted blood. He turned to his favorite general, the Croatian renegade Yusuf Pasha. Yusuf gathered an armada of 400 ships and 50,000 men. To keep the Venetians asleep, He spread rumors that the fleet was sailing for Malta. The deception worked. In June 1645, the Ottomans landed on Crete, catching the Venetians completely unprepared. Yusuf Pasha took the city of Candia in just 56 days. He returned to Constantinople a conqueror. But in the court of a mad king, success is dangerous. Sultan Ibrahim was furious that Yusuf hadn't conquered the entire island in one summer. When Yusuf tried to explain the difficulty of the campaign, the Sultan called him a traitor and ordered his execution. Yusuf Pasha was beheaded on the palace floor. The war was 1 year old, and the Ottomans had already killed their own best general. By May 1648, the Ottoman army reached the capital, Candia. They expected another quick victory. Instead, they found themselves staring at the most terrifying defensive structure in the Mediterranean. Candia was not a medieval castle. It was a masterpiece of the Tres Italienne, the Star Fort. Designed by the legendary architect Michele Sanmicheli, the city was enclosed by a massive ring of 7 arrow-shaped bastions. Their names would become legendary: Panigra, Bethlehem, Martinengo, Jesus, and Sabbionara. These weren't just walls. They were artificial mountains of earth and stone, 20 meters thick at the base, designed to absorb cannonballs like a sponge. In front of them lay a dry moat, 15 meters deep and 30 meters wide. Inside the city, the defense was led by a diverse and desperate garrison. There were 3,500 professional mercenaries, French, Italian, German, supported by 2,000 local Greek militia. They were outnumbered 10-1. The new Ottoman commander, Ghazi Deli Hussein Pasha, the Mad, tried to crush them with brute force. On June 18, 1648, he ordered a massive frontal assault. It was a massacre. The Venetian artillery fired grape shot, canvas bags packed with scrap metal that turned cannons into giant shotguns. As the Ottomans crowded into the moat, the defenders dropped glass grenades, fragile spheres filled with gunpowder that exploded on impact, filling the air with razor-sharp shrapnel. The Ottoman ladders were too short to scale the sloping walls. In 3 hours, 1,800 Ottomans died. The Venetians lost barely 100 men. Deli Hussein realized the walls could not be stormed. They had to be dismantled. The Ottomans shifted their strategy. They stopped charging and started digging. They constructed a massive network of zigzag approach trenches that crept toward the walls, inch by inch. The real war moved underground. The Ottomans dug mines, tunnels beneath the walls packed with gunpowder. But the Venetians had a countermove: Georg Rimpler. Rimpler was a German engineer who treated the siege like a geometry problem. He designed retrenchments, secondary walls built inside the city. Even if the Ottomans blew up a bastion, they wouldn't enter the city. They would stumble into a pre-designed killing zone shaped like a horseshoe and packed with cannons. Rimpler also organized the countermines. Venetian sappers dug into the earth to find the Ottoman tunnels. It became a war of acoustic terror. Sappers sat in the dark, pressing their ears to the rock, listening for the tap, tap, tap of enemy pickaxes. When they found a tunnel, they didn't just blow it up. They used camouflages, small charges designed to collapse the enemy tunnel and bury the miners alive without breaking the surface. A Venetian sapper named Tommaso Mullen described the horror. He developed a permanent tremor in his hands from the constant vibration of underground explosions. He couldn't eat solid food because the shock waves had loosened his teeth. While the sun scorched the ruins above, the most terrifying theater of the war was unfolding in total darkness. By the 1660s, the ground beneath Candia was a honeycomb of over 60 miles of tunnels. This wasn't just engineering, it was a claustrophobic nightmare. Venetian sappers lived like moles. They used copper bowls filled with water to detect the slightest ripple of an Ottoman pickaxe nearby. When the two sides met underground, there was no room for muskets. They fought with knives, daggers, and their bare hands in tunnels so narrow a man couldn't turn around. If you heard the enemy through the wall, you didn't just dig, you prayed your camouflage charge was faster than theirs. The Ottomans became masters of the Great Mine. They would pack thousands of pounds of gunpowder into a single chamber and vaporize an entire bastion in a heartbeat. One survivor, a German mercenary, wrote that the earth didn't just shake, it liquidized. Men were buried alive in the very trenches they had dug for protection, their bodies becoming part of the city's foundation. For the soldiers of Candia, the city of dead men wasn't just a nickname. It was a literal description of the soil beneath their feet. While the soldiers bled in the dirt, the fate of Candia was actually being decided hundreds of miles away on the open sea. The Venetians knew they couldn't defeat the Ottoman army on land. Their only hope was to starve them out by blocking the Dardanelles Strait, the choke point where the Ottoman fleet had to pass to reach the Mediterranean. This naval war produced its own legends. One of them was the Venetian admiral Lazzaro Mocenigo. Mocenigo was aggressive to the point of recklessness. He didn't just blockade, he hunted. In July 1651, off the island of Paros, a Venetian fleet of 30 galleys intercepted a massive Ottoman armada of 50 ships. Outnumbered, the Venetian commander, Giacomo Riva, unleashed a terrifying weapon, the fire ship. These were old galleys packed with gunpowder, pitch, and sulfur set on fire and drifted into the enemy lines. At Paros, a Venetian fire ship slammed into the Ottoman flagship. The explosion was so violent it panicked the entire Turkish fleet. In the chaos, the Venetians sank or captured 11 Ottoman ships. It was a stunning victory that kept Candia's supply lines open. But the Ottomans had endless resources. In 1654, they broke the blockade with a massive fleet of 73 vessels. The Venetians tried to re-establish it in 1657, but tragedy struck. Lazzaro Mocenigo, the Sea Lion, was leading a daring assault into the Dardanelles when a falling mast struck him on the deck of his own flagship, killing him instantly. With Mocenigo dead, the Venetian noose loosened. The Ottomans poured fresh troops into Crete. The sea could no longer save the city. While the Ottomans poured thousands of men into the trenches of Candia, they were being bled white from behind by a ghost fleet. The Knights of Malta, the same pirate monks who sparked the war, never stopped fighting. They turned the Aegean Sea into a graveyard for Ottoman supply ships. These weren't just soldiers, they were the elite special forces of the 17th century. Operating from their fortress island, they used galliots, small, lightning-fast vessels, to strike Ottoman convoys carrying food, timber, and gunpowder to the siege. Every loaf of bread that didn't reach a hungry Ottoman soldier in the trenches was a victory for the knights. The Ottoman viziers were humiliated. They had the largest army on earth, yet they couldn't protect their own backyard. The knights even developed a terrifying psychological tactic. They would capture Ottoman messengers and send them back to the mainland with their ears and noses missing, carrying a single message: Malta still stands. This constant harassment forced the Sultan to divert dozens of warships away from the blockade of Candia just to hunt the knights. It was a war of 1,000 stabs. Without the Knights of Malta acting as the hounds of the Mediterranean, Candia would likely have fallen a decade sooner. Back in Venice, the war wasn't just killing men, it was killing the Republic's soul. By 1660, the Venetian Senate was spending 4 million ducats a year on the siege, while their entire annual revenue was only 2 million. They were spending double what they earned just to keep Candia alive. Desperate for cash, the proud Venetian aristocracy did the unthinkable. They opened the Golden Book, the registry of nobility. For centuries, you had to be born a noble. Now, for the price of 100,000 ducats, you could buy your way in. Wealthy merchants bought titles to fund the gunpowder sent to Crete. The old families hated it, but the war machine demanded gold. And while the rich bought titles, the soldiers paid with their lives, not to bullets, but to bacteria. In 1656, the plague arrived. It hit the besiegers harder than the besieged. The Ottoman camps were filthy, crowded tent cities. The plague killed an estimated 20,000 Ottoman soldiers in a single year. This was when the Venetian biological warfare plot was hatched. Leonardo Foscolo, the governor of Dalmatia, recruited Dr. Salomon to distill his quintessence of plague. The plan was to infect the Ottoman reinforcements before they even reached the trenches. Dr. Salomon was put on a ship with his jar of death, with strict orders: if the jar breaks, throw the doctor and the poison into the sea immediately. The plot failed due to shipping delays and the winter cold, which likely killed the bacteria. But it showed the world that the civilized Republic of Venice was willing to unleash a pandemic to save a single city. As the treasury in Venice ran dry, the Republic turned to the only power left, the papacy. Venetian ambassadors begged Pope Alexander VII for a Holy League, a crusade to save the last Christian outpost in the East. The Pope gave them his blessing. He gave them his tears. But he couldn't give them an army. Europe was exhausted. The Sun King, Louis XIV, was more interested in expanding his own borders than fighting the infidel in a lost cause. England and the Netherlands were too busy fighting each other for control of the seas to care about a crumbling fortress on Crete. Venice was the shield of Christendom, but the shield was cracked, and the rest of the world was looking away. This isolation led to a cultural suicide. The Venetian Senate, once the most exclusive club in the world, was now effectively a pawnshop. They weren't just selling titles anymore. They were selling the Republic's future. The message from the rest of the world was clear. Candia was a ghost ship, and no one wanted to board. The Venetians were left with a choice: die with honor in the rubble or find a way to end the nightmare. As the siege dragged into its second decade, it sucked in the rest of Europe. But not everyone came willingly. Enter the Douglas Regiment, a unit of tough Scottish mercenaries serving the King of France. Their commander, Lord George Douglas, found himself in a lethal political game between Louis XIV of France and Charles II of England. Louis XIV wanted to punish the English king, so he devised a cruel use for the Scots. He ordered the Douglas Regiment to be the vanguard of a relief force for Candia. Lord Douglas was horrified. He knew that sending his men to the graveyard of Candia was a death sentence designed to spite the English king. Diplomats scrambled. Charles II was outraged, fearing that if his Scottish subjects fought the Turks, it would ruin English trade deals with the Ottoman Empire. In the end, many Scots went anyway, volunteering for the adventure. They joined a massive French expeditionary force led by the reckless Duc de Beaufort. The French arrived in 1669 like knights in a fairy tale, convinced they would save the day. The Duc de Beaufort ignored the warnings of the exhausted Venetian commanders. He ordered a massive, glorious charge against the Ottoman lines. It was a disaster. The French were slaughtered in the unfamiliar trenches. But the real catastrophe happened at sea. On July 24, 1669, the French flagship La Thérèse, carrying the fleet's gunpowder, suffered an accidental fire. It exploded with a force that shook the entire island. The blast killed the French admiral and shattered the morale of the relief force. The Duc de Beaufort himself vanished in the chaos of the land battle. His body was never found, likely blown to pieces or buried in the mud. The French packed up and left. The Scots who survived the debacle returned home, having been used as pawns in a game they couldn't win. Candia was alone again. The end of Candia didn't come from a cannon. It came from a map. In 1666, the Ottomans appointed a new Grand Vizier, Kuprulu Fazıl Ahmed. They called him the Righteous. He was unlike the butchers who came before him. He was a cold, calculating intellectual who cleaned up the camps, stopped the mutinies, and waited. His patience was rewarded by a traitor. Andrea Barozzi was a Venetian colonel, a veteran engineer who knew every stone of Candia. Broken by 20 years of war, or perhaps simply greedy, Barozzi defected. He brought Kuprulu the one thing the Ottomans lacked, the blueprints. Barozzi pointed to the Martinengo bastion and the Sabbionera. He showed them exactly where the walls were weak and, crucially, where the Venetian countermines were dug. Armed with this knowledge, Kuprulu didn't charge blindly. He surgically dismantled the defenses. He targeted the weak points Barozzi revealed. The Venetian defensive ring began to collapse. Inside the city, the commander Francesco Morosini, the reluctant hero, realized the game was up. Morosini was a hard man. He had rationed food until the civilians were eating weeds. He had walked the walls every night for years. But now he had fewer than 4,000 men left to hold a perimeter designed for 15,000. On September 27, 1669, the guns finally stopped. Francesco Morosini surrendered, but he didn't surrender unconditionally. He demanded and got honorable terms. The surviving defenders were allowed to march out with their flags flying and their weapons in hand. The Grand Vizier Kuprulu stood at the gates and watched them leave. He was respectful. He knew the cost. The Ottomans had sacrificed over 100,000 men to take this one city. The Venetians had lost 30,000. When Kuprulu entered the city, he found it was a ruin. The swine's snare was a pile of rubble. The churches were empty. Was it worth it? Venice lost its dominance in the Mediterranean forever. The Ottoman Empire spent so much blood and treasure on this one island that it weakened them for their disastrous war against Vienna just 15 years later, but the men who survived carried the story home. Grand Master Cotonner of the Knights of Malta returned to his island and built the massive Cotonera lines, terrified that the Ottomans would come for him next. The Scottish survivors of the Douglas Regiment brought back tales of a hell on earth. And Dr. Salomon's jar of plague? It disappeared into history, a reminder of the dark roads men walk when they refuse to admit defeat. Candia fell. But the story of its 21-year resistance remains a testament to the terrifying endurance of the human spirit.